As you may know, today's shir is dedicated in memory of one of the great Torah transmitters of Canada, of our generation. And for those of his many students, some may be here today, some may join us later, the expression of gratitude that we have for our Rebbe cannot be limited. It cannot be put into words. And when we gather together as Talmidim of a Rebbe, and we express our gratitude, in this case, in honor of the Yartzeit, we often think of the paradigm of a Rebbe, the greatest transmitter of Torah of all of Jewish history, and that is Moshe Rabbeinu. And I'd like to focus your attention on three dimensions of our great Rebbe Moshe Rabbeinu and apply them to Rabbi Silver. Moshe Rabbeinu, first and foremost, was Anov Mikol Adam. His humility was unsurpassed. And when we speak about Rav Silver, we think automatically of his humility. And all of his students unanimously testify to an individual to whom kavod, honor, was meaningless. His goal in life was to transmit Torah. Like Moshe Rabbeinu, the Eved Hashem, Moshe Avdi, he was dedicated exclusively to serve Hashem, l'shem shamayim, not for any ulterior motives. And the second dimension of Moshe Rabbeinu in his life is his love for the people, every individual, and certainly for the community of Israel, at great sacrifice. And in the case of Rabbi Silver, again, we're talking about a person whose Talmidim testify about him, that he cared not only for the klal, but for each individual. It was a personal relationship. His students saw in him a walking, living Sefer Torah, a paradigm of what a Torah Jew is meant to be. And just as our Chazal tell us that the people of Israel carefully scrutinized and watched every move of Moshe Rabbeinu to learn from him, to glean from him. And sometimes action speaks louder than words. To imitate, to emulate Moshe Rabbeinu. So to the myriads, almost countless numbers of people whose lives were touched by Rabbi Silver, Zichrono Livracha, will testify to the fact that any personal contact that they had with him was an opportunity to learn from him, to emulate him, to rub shoulders with him, to come close to a person who would uplift them, who would inspire them. It was a Torah Chaim, a true living Torah. And thirdly, what certainly we could say about Moshe Rabbeinu without a doubt is that he represented the greatest scholar. Chazal say that no Talmud today, no matter how long he is after Moshe Rabbeinu, could come up with an insight that Moshe Rabbeinu was not aware of. And Moshe's Torah divided into two. It was methodology, what we call today lumdus. Moshe Rabbeinu is the great father of the method by which we study Torah. But at the same time, Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah was a Torah's Maisa, a Torah's Asiyah. It taught us how to live our lives. It was not just abstract. And so too, Rabbi Silver, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was such a unique integration of both methodology, the understanding of Torah, the analysis of halacha, and decades of Mesiris Nefesh to Klal Yisrael, to individuals, to create that special relationship between a Rebbe and a Talmud. his integration of loveness, and I was zoche to hear from some of his Talmidim some of his brilliant insights, together with his understanding, his grasp of halacha, his connection with Gedolim, with greats of past generations. So we, from the perspective of Talmidim, have nothing more to say than that Rabbi Silva of Shalom should be a Melitz Yosher. And we know for sure that, like Moshe Rabbeinu, the ultimate teacher and the ultimate leader, the lover of Klal Yisrael, he too, following in that footsteps as a leader of Klal Yisrael, the impact, the initiatives, the various programs that have influenced decades upon decades of Jews in Toronto and in Montreal. I came to Toronto. By that time, Rabbi Silva was already in Montreal. We could only see him on a kind of a Zoom screen. Those days we weren't using Zoom yet. So I too, in my own little humble way, of following in his footsteps, trying to teach Torah long distance over modern technology. Yiratzon may be a Melitz Yosher for all of Klal Yisrael, both Yachid and Yechidim and Pratim, and the Klal, of course. At this time, when we so need someone to project our interests up on high, Yehei Zichro Baruch, Yitzadik, Zocha Livrocha, Amen. This year is part of a series on contemporary halacha, and today we're going to focus on one dimension of contemporary halacha, and that is treating corona patients. So we're not talking about vaccines. We spoke about vaccines in the past. We're talking about actual corona patients, critically ill patients, and in general, as you know, for the sake of saving a critically ill patient, the halakha, the Torah requires that we violate all the Yisurim of the Torah, including Shabbos. I'm going to use as my text today a tshuva, a response, written by a Rav, one of the great contemporary poskim, Rabbanim, in Lakewood, New Jersey, Rav Moshe Rotberg, in a book called Lahachyos Amra, a book that he authored not long ago. It's fresh and crisp in order to address the questions that have come up in contemporary life. And today we'll focus on treatment for corona patients. He points out at the very beginning of his essay that there's something about corona that is very unique. And we're still within that period of time in which we really don't have a grasp, a total understanding of what is the proper treatment for corona patients, especially those who are critical, and to what extent can we consider a certain treatment, if we administer it, as refuah, such that for the sake of pikuach nefesh will override the Shabbos. He presents 4 different questions that came up in a very short period of time. This is a tshuva responsa that's written, that's authored by someone who has a hands-on relationship with the Hatzalah in the state of New Jersey. And I don't have to tell you about the statistics of corona in New Jersey. New Jersey is what we'd call red hot. In fact, if you turn back the clock a little bit more than a year ago, Purim, the first corona patients in the state of New Jersey were yeshiva students, Avrechim, in Kollel, in New Jersey. Little did they know that their warmth on Purim, Simcha of Purim, would lead to such a large number of people coming down with this disease. A disease that, as you know, is very infectious and requires all sorts of precautions and distancing. And here are the 4 questions, one by one, that were presented to the rabbi in New Jersey. The first question was about plasma. This is a possibility of using a former corona patient who recovered from the disease by extracting blood, plasma, and donating it and injecting it into a critically ill corona patient. And many physicians were of the opinion that this could save lives. However, in a sense, the flip side of the equation when it comes to Shabbos is that it's a process. It's not like you donate blood and it's all over. Zbang, as we call it here in Israel, and we can save a life. There's an entire process. They had to import tests from various states. They would test a person's blood. They would determine if he had antibodies, if it was a good match for a critically ill patient. And now the question is, do we override the Shabbos for a situation of a refuah that's not necessarily going to help? Some physicians thought it would, others did not. But more important is that nothing's going to happen on Shabbos other than the first stage in testing. And of course, the health authorities called upon various Avrechim in the city of Lakewood to come, in this particular case, on Shabbos, so that a blood could be extracted from the body. Many, many violations of Shabbos were entailed, so that they can analyze and investigate the blood and see if there was plasma, if there was antibodies in the blood. But the actual process by which we could save lives would be down the line. Do we violate the Shabbos only in a case where immediately, as we violate the Shabbos, we have a cure? Or can we do so on deposit and we put the blood into the bank after we determine that in fact this could help and this donation and transfusion could work? Question number 2. A few weeks later, the Hatzalah people called the rabbi and they asked him, what about a situation in which Avrechim were called upon on Shabbos and they've already determined through various testing that these Avrechim, these yeshiva students, have the antibodies? And now we get into the issue of a possibility of immediately, urgently helping a critically ill patient with this treatment. Now, in order to appreciate the background of this question, let me mention again something that's unique about Corona. In the history of modern medicine, in order to establish a recognized refuah that would be acknowledged by the health authorities on the highest level, you need an entire series of testing that takes place over the course of years and years. And in fact, the scientists believe in a testing that's called RCT, which is called randomized controlled trials. That means that no one knows exactly what's going on. People are administered what might be a placebo, what might be a possible trufa, an element that might help them. Even the person who donates doesn't know which is the actual herb or drug that's being tested. And only under those very controlled scenarios can we determine, after years and years of experience, that something can be okayed and can be administered according to the authorities. In Corona, different things were happening. There was no real serious opportunity to test out remedies over the course of years in the most controlled experimental conditions. It just wasn't possible. We're looking at a situation in which they're critically ill people. We may not know whether a particular treatment will help or will not help. There's even a possibility that it could be detrimental. But what are the other options? Let the patient die? And therefore, the health authorities, under rare conditions, were allowing the administration of certain kinds of medical procedures and certain kinds of drugs to be used, even though they had not passed the tests that normal standards would have required them in order to allow and give the gushpank, as we call it, to allow these kinds of therapeutic methods to be used. But we're facing a situation in which you have to decide, in a desperate case, what are your options? Do nothing, or at least make a trial, make an effort. And at that point in time, when the issue was, and this was a serious debate amongst the physicians, whether or not this particular transplant, this particular transfusion of blood plasma could in fact help the critically ill. There were those who said yes, there were those who said no, there were those who said it's going to have a detrimental effect. To violate the Shabbos, even if we determine that so-and-so has the antibodies in his blood plasma, and we violate the Shabbos for an unsure medical procedure, even though it could be administered immediately, urgently, for a critically ill corona patient now on Shabbos. And now we get to question number 3 that is presented here by the rabbi in this tshuva. In the third question, what we have is what's called in Hebrew a mishcha. A mishcha in English, I guess you translate it as an ointment. And it seems that there was a certain ointment that normally we use to anoint a body, spread on a body. And one of the Avrechim got in touch with Hatzalah to ask the question whether we can violate the Shabbos for the sake of his own father, who was hospitalized in critical condition with corona, and anoint him with this mishcha, which there was no scientific, there was no basis, there was no serious physician who had any clue whatsoever as to why this anointment could possibly be beneficial. No one, not even one expert, would come to vouch for this anointment. Just that there was talk amongst the people, we call it anecdotal talk, that there were corona patients who were helped by this concoction. And in order to get to the hospital on Shabbos and appoint someone, again, I'm not sure the hospital would have allowed this, but let's assume that the hospital would have allowed this, hard to believe, that someone would take this ointment and apply it to the body of this Avrech's father in the hope that it might save his life. Can we violate the Shabbos? And the fourth question, which I find most fascinating, because you have to keep in mind, I live in an area which is heavily populated by Hasidic Jews. Each one has his own Hasidic Rebbe. And in this case, one of the ill patients who was in critical condition was begging on Shabbos, please call my Rebbe, my Hasidic Rebbe in Eretz Yisrael. He has the power to give me a bracha that would save my life. And it involved calling up the Rebbe. It was not clear whether the Rebbe would respond. Could you get through to him on Shabbos? There was a whole to-do about this. Do we violate the Shabbos, hoping to save a Jewish life by a Hasidic Rebbe? These are the 4 questions that are being addressed today. They're all 4 Shabbos questions. And again, as I said, this is part of a series. For those who are just joining today, we have discussed many, many different areas of Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, Even Ezer. We've discussed mikvos issues, tefillah issues, But today we're dedicating our discussion to Shabbos. And now we start the response of the rabbi. We begin, again, I apologize to those who are not familiar with the names here, but the names are given in Hebrew. It's not so critical. You can still follow me. The Magen Avram, perhaps the most important Ashkenazic posek since the Ramah, 4.5 centuries ago, writes in Orach Chaim Simon Shin Chav Ches, which is the Simon that's dedicated to Pikuach Nefesh, to saving lives on Shabbos. He says that what we need in order to qualify for violating the Shabbos is we need a refuah yedua, a known therapeutic method, well established. Or alternatively, in the absence of a refuah yedua, an established method, we need at the very least a mumcha, an expert, to recommend using this refuah and testifying that he knows, based on his experience and his knowledge, that this is a valid refuah. Otherwise, we will not violate the Shabbos. How did the Ramah know such a thing? And this is a Gemara on Daf Pei Gimel 83a in Masechta Yoma about a person who was attacked and bitten by a rabid dog. And the method of saving his life would be, believe it or not, to feed the man that dog's liver. And the Gemara says that the dog's liver, which is called treifa, is not allowed to be eaten. We cannot feed him that liver. Why not? So the Gemara quotes a machlokas, a debate between the Chachamim and Rabbi Masya, two Tanoim, and the Chachamim say that it's not a refuah gemura. It's not a bona fide method of refuah. Why should the liver of a rabid dog save this man's life? And Rabbi Masya says, the way Rashi interprets it, no, this is a refuah gemura. This is a total, absolute, reliable refuah. And we posted like the Chachamim against Rabbi Masya, and therefore we're not going to allow overriding the kashrus laws for the sake of a refuah she'ena gemura. And the Magen Avram, with a Kal Vachomer argument, says how much more so would we not violate the Shabbos for a refuah that fails short of being qualified as a refuah gemura. Rashi says that according to the Chachamim, we cannot allow for this eating because it's not a refuah gemura, it's not a total reliable refuah. And Rabbi Masya disagrees and he allows it, but only because he was convinced that it's a refuah gemura. And here we have a basic question. The Gemara tells us at the very end of Masechta Yoma that we will violate the Shabbos for a safek pikuach nefesh, on the outside chance that we could save a Jewish life. I don't know if saving him by eating the liver is going to be a refuah gemura and we'll save him. It won't be a refuah gemura, we won't save him, but give it a try. Why not override the violations of the Torah for the sake of the possibility? Safek pikuach nefesh, even in a doubt, overrides the law. And this is an unbelievable question. And someone interpret that, you know what, maybe the Gemara, when it speaks about the case of someone who was bitten by a dog, maybe he wasn't in critical condition. We assumed, and that's a simple reading of the Gemara, the Mishnah, that he was critically bitten. He's a rabid dog. But maybe, you know what? He's not critical. He's what's called, again, for those who follow the terminology, chole she'ein bo sakana. And maybe that's the way of understanding the Gemara. We will not allow eating non-kosher food for the sake of saving someone who's not in danger. But nevertheless, it would seem, and that's certainly how the Magen Avraham and Rashi before the Magen Avraham understood the Gemara, that we will not apply this method and override the Torah's law, even in the case of a chol sheyesh bo sakana, even in the case of a life-threatening situation, because it's not a refuah gemura, says Rashi. The Rambam, in his commentary on the Mishnah in Yoma, Pirush HaMishnayos, goes even further. The Rambam writes, Ein halacha k'Rabbi Masya, we will not accept the leniency of Rabbi Masya, ki eino moil ela derech skula. A whole new word. The Rambam says that for the victim to eat the attacker, the dog's liver, is not a refuah, it's derech skula. But listen carefully to the language of the Rambam when he calls it derech skula. It's some sort of magical therapy. He says, Eino moil ela derech skula. It will only be effective because it's a skula. Now, I don't know if any of you here have ever done any skulas. If you're learning the Daf Yomi, you'll know what I mean. There are all sorts of skulas in the Gemara. But the Rambam says, Ein ovrim al mitzvahs haTorah, we will not violate the laws of the Torah, ela l'refuah, shehu refuah al pi teva, unless the therapy works in a natural scientific way, cause and effect, the law of causality, but not if it works derech skula. What is going on? If the Rambam would have denied that this skula has any efficacy, it's just a joke. This is a bunch of superstitious, stupid people. Okay, so we're not going to violate the Torah law because somebody decided that he's got to eat the liver of a dog. But if the Rambam is saying that Eino moil ela derech skula, that it seems the Rambam is implying it could work, and it might save his life, but it only does so shalom piteva, not through the laws of nature, but through skula. The Rambam says we're not allowed to apply this and violate the Torah law. Why not? If it'll work, if it'll save someone's life, why shouldn't it be acceptable? And you should know that 5 centuries ago, in a super commentary on the Rambam, Rabbeinu David Ibn Zimra, the Radbaz, writes a tshuva, and he says that you're right. On a Torah basis, according to biblical law, we will violate the law of the Torah for the sake of saving someone's life, even with derech skula. But the Rabbanan made a gzeira. They were afraid that this might be taken too far, and who knows what kind of violations of the law they would implement, and therefore they made a gzeira. And they instituted a decree, asus yag la Torah. They made a fence around the Torah. And in order to prevent the Torah from being violated haphazardly, they said we will not allow violating the Torah derech skula. That's how Father Adbaz went in trying to understand this Rambam. But with all due respect to Adbaz, I mean, this is not simple, straightforward pshat in the Rambam or in Rashi. We're not talking about a gzeira d'Rabbanan. We're talking about a serious biblical limitation and restriction in the halacha of pikuach nefesh. And pikuach nefesh, saving a life, will override the Shabbos, but only b'derech refuah al piteva, but not derech skula. How do you understand that? Even if you'll argue that it's not definite that it'll work and it'll be effective, but at least it's a suffix. Maybe it'll work, save a life. Pikuach nefesh, even in the case of suffix, overrides the most serious violations of the Torah. There's a tshuva of the Radbaz. I'm sorry, the tshuva of the Rashba. Rashba is already going back 9 centuries ago. Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Aderes says the Rashba in his tshuva that there's something called a kamiyah. We call it in English an amulet. And he writes, Kosvin kamiyah afilu b'Shabbos lecholesh yesh bo sakana. To save a life, we will violate the Shabbos and allow writing an amulet, a kamiyah. However, by Medvar Amurim says Rashba, when is this applicable? That's only the Tavi Inu, that he, the Chole himself, is demanding a kamiyah. Uli Yisuve Daite. And we want to calm him down because he's in a mad rage, Nebuch. His life is on the line. However, in the absence of his pressing that button, you remember the buttons in the hospital, to call the nurse and tell her, oh, I want this amulet being written. In the absence of that, says the Rashba, we will only allow the writing of an amulet on Shabbos if, number one, it is written by a proven amulet writer. It's muchzak gavra, what we call. So we know that he's amche, he's a mumche, because he's already proven on 3 occasions that he wrote amulets and he saved people's lives. Or in the absence of a mumche gavra, we have mumche in the kamiyah. In other words, the exact same kamiyah for this disease has operated 3 times in the past. But you see that on the one hand, the Rashba is accepting the possibility of overriding the Shabbos with a derech skula, with an amulet that's not scientifically proven, no way, no how. But on the other hand, he requires one of 2 things: either that it's yisubei daite, because the chole is losing his marbles, or alternatively that we know for sure that we can save his life because this has been proven as an amulet in the past. But Rashi and the Rambam are saying that we will not violate the law in a case of derech skula, only in the case of a refuah al pi derech hatev. And we don't know why. You could call it a suffix refuah. We don't know if it is a refuah and it will be helpful or not, but call it a suffix. The Rambam says we don't know if it's going to help, if it'll be efficacious. And now, my friends, we get to the crux of the matter. From whence do we know what is the source for the halacha, the principle that in pikuach nefesh we override the Shabbos? The Gemara in Yoma offers 2 answers to this question. The first answer is Reb Shimon ben Menashe. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael es haShabbos. Omer Torah, chalel alav Shabbos achas kidei sheyishmar Shabbos harbe. There's a trade-off over here. The Torah wants us to observe the Shabbos. Says Reb Shimon, if we violate the Shabbos for one occasion, and now the person, the victim, will survive and he'll observe many Shabbosos, weigh it on a scale, we're going to sacrifice and waive one Shabbos for the sake of many Shabbosos. And then the Gemara quotes Shmuel. Shmuel says, Nemar, v'chai bohem. We should live by the Torah laws. V'chai bohem v'lo sheyamus bohem. And now, my friends, we want to study a letter that was written 2.5 centuries ago by Rabbi Kiva Eger, the great genius of his time, to one of his great contemporaries, the base mayor, the mayor of Posen. And in that letter, Rabbi Kiva Eger says that based on the Magen Avram and Siman Shin Lamed, we will not violate the Shabbos to save the life of a karoi, of a Karaite. Says Rabbi Kiva Eger, I don't understand the Magen Avram. The Torah says v'chai bohem. And even if he's a karoi, and we know that he's going to violate the Shabbos. He will violate the Shabbos because he doesn't accept Torah Shemal Peh. All of Yisrael mumar. Mumar means a Jew who violates the Torah consistently, but we have to save his life. The Torah says v'chayba. We don't have to check his religious level. And the Beis Meir responds in a letter, and he writes that even Shmuel, who invokes the pasuk v'chaybahem, he also accepts the first answer of Rab Shimon ben Manasseh of Ishamru b'nei Yisrael Shabbos, namely, give up on one Shabbos for the sake of many future Shabbosos. And in the case of Karoi, we know that he's not going to be observing many Shabbosos. Says the Beis Meir, Shmuel of V'chaybahem accepts V'shamru of Rab Shimon ben Manasseh. And in this case of a Karoi, although we may have V'chaybahem, but we don't have V'shamru. And we will not override the Shabbos. And that's how the Beis Meir defends the Magen Avraham. So now we can summarize the debate between Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Beis Meir. What are they arguing about? Rabbi Akiva Eiger understood there are two distinct reasons why we override the Shabbos, and they both operate independent, one or the other. If you could check off one of these two, then you violate the Shabbos. Either you have a Chai Bohem, or alternatively, you have a Shamru. And in the case of a Karoi, okay, you don't have a Shamru, we don't assume that he's going to observe Shabbos down the line, but we have a Chai Bohem. But the Beis Meir understood, no, it's a package deal. We need both of them. We need A plus B. It's got to be number one, v'chai bohem, but number two, it's got to be v'shamru. And the flip side is true as well. According to the Beis Meir, you need v'shamru and you need v'chai bohem. So we have to have two conditions fulfilled. There are many proofs from halacha that Rabbi Akiva Eiger is correct. And the logic is with him. Compelling arguments that either one of these two reasons, whether it's v'shamru many Shabbosos or whether it's v'chai bohem, will operate independent one of the other. Let's mention a few of the proofs. Number one, the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Vav in Hilchos Shabbos describes a scenario where the missionaries, I'm going to assume they're Christian missionaries, are taking a person's daughter away, a young girl, and they're taking her on Shabbos to their missionary, to their convent, or wherever it is, and we will violate the Shabbos if need be in order to prevent this from happening. Question is, where's v'chai bohem? Her life is not in danger. On the contrary, they want to train her to be the next nun. No one's putting her life into danger. But the answer is that we're going to violate the Shabbos not because of a chai bohem, but because of a shamru. Because her life will be a life of a different religion, she'll be baptized, etc., etc. And now, for the sake of many Shabbosos, we will violate one single Shabbos. You see clearly that these two logical reasons operate independent one of the other. Proof number two. The Gemara establishes in Yuma Matzilin Mishum Chai Shah. Imagine the situation where we can violate the Shabbos and give a person another day, another 2 days of life. We will violate the Shabbos. The Gemara establishes. But why? Admittedly, I have a Chai Bohem because Chai Shah, to give him extend his life for an hour or a day, that's called v'chai bohem, but there's no v'shamru. The doctors clearly admit that he's not going to last until Shabbos. There's no possibility of his observing the Shabbos. But the answer is, as we said before, v'shamru and v'chai bohem operate independently. Proof number three. The Gemara tells us that if you find a baby that was left in the streets, an abandoned infant, and the city is made up mostly of non-Jews, and now the baby's life is in danger and it's Shabbos, do we violate the Shabbos to save a baby Again, I'm leaving out the issue of Ava and so forth. Those who know what I'm talking about, that's a different shir for a different topic. But we only violate the Shabbos for the sake of a Jewish life. And now the baby is probably not Jewish. And we have a principle called Rove. We rely on Rove, and most of the population of the city is not Jewish. The Gemara says, Mafachin olav esagal, which means that if the baby is in a precarious, dangerous situation, we'll override the Shabbos for the sake of the baby. Now, for all other laws, this baby is treated as a non-Jew based on Rove. We will not allow this baby until the baby undergoes gerus when he's old enough, he or she, to observe the Shabbos. Because a non-Jew is not allowed to observe the Shabbos. They'll let him take Sunday. So now we're in a funny situation here. Because of the principle that v'chai b'hem overrides even a suffix, we will override the Shabbos, but there's no v'shamru. There's no possibility at this stage. Again, after gerus is a different story. It's like a baby. But now there's no v'shamru. We're not going to allow this child when the child is of age to observe the Shabbos, because a guy is not allowed to observe the Shabbos. Once again, we see that v'chai b'hem operates in its own without v'shamru. How are we meant to understand this? What is the difference between the two? In a beautiful presentation, our author presents the fundamental difference between these two principles, one of v'chai b'hem and the other of v'shamru. He bases himself on a tshuva of the Divrei Malkiel. We're not going to go through the tshuva, but let's just get to the punchline, so to speak. He says the following. We can wonder regarding both of these principles, is the Torah allowing us to override its own violations, its own prohibitions, or is the Torah obligating us for the sake of Hatzalah to save a life in the mitzvah of, shall we say, Hashivoso lo is one source, or lo tamid al tamriyecha, whatever it might be, the source for the mitzvah, the great mitzvah of Hatzalah. And he says the following, that v'chai b'hem is a general rule with regard to the Torah violations. And the Torah says that under certain circumstances, very subscribed and very limited circumstances, restricted with many conditions, we can override the Torah law for v'chai b'hem. The Shamru is a different halacha entirely. The Shamru is not a halacha of Isurim, or we violating the law of the Torah. The Shamru is telling us how to observe the Shabbos. And Reb Shimon ben Menashe says, how do you observe the Shabbos? Shabbos is harbe. Observe many Shabbos. You have to lose one on the way. Fine. That becomes obligatory. That becomes a fulfillment of the observance of Shabbos. Observe the Shabbos by violating the Shabbos. As paradoxical as that sounds, that's exactly the essence of V'shamru. Not so when it comes to v'chai b'hem. And he has a beautiful proof for this, which he bases on a Tosfos in Bava Metzia of all places. Tosfos wants to know, you remember that Eliyahu Hanavi resuscitated a young boy's body after he had technically died. Now, Eliyahu, the Gemara tells us, was a Kohen. I don't know how many people here today are Kohen. I hope we have a few. Where I come from, we're lucky if we get one Kohen. Such a dearth of Kohen in here. In any event, Eliyahu Hanavi was a Kohen. Now, a Kohen is enjoined from being mitame mes. And when Elio puts his body, his mouth to mouth, etc., to resuscitate the boy, he contracts tumor, something that's normally prohibited for a Kohen. So Tosfos asks the question, why was Elio allowed to do this? Interesting, when you learn Tanakh through the eyes of the halacha. Says Tosfos, because Elio was absolutely certain that he would be able to bring the baby back to life. So the Nitziv Mivalozhin, the great Rosh Yeshiva of the mother of all yeshivas, of Lithuanian yeshivas, the Nitziv, asks the following question. I don't get it. We violate the Torah even for a suffix. Why does Tosfos insist that it has to be Vada? In other words, we have to be absolutely certain, and it's only because Elio knew for sure that he would be able to resuscitate the baby. Therefore, he violated the Isur of Tumas Kohen. Even in a case of suffix. For Pikuach Nefesh, we override the Torah law. Says the Nitziv. Are you listening? There's no v'chai b'hem vis-a-vis a dead person. The baby was dead already. To resurrect a baby is not v'chai b'hem. Says the Nitziv, we can only override the Torah to resurrect the dead if we are guaranteed that at the end of the day, in the balance, we get more mitzvahs than violating this one avera. So it's the ultimate pragmatic consideration that we discussed before. That's Vishamru. Says the Nitziv, the concept of Vishamru, give up one Shabbos for the sake of many Shabbos, only applies in the case of Vadai. Only if you're absolutely certain that you will have future Shabbosos or future observances of the Torah law. And the Nitziv points out that the halacha that Safek Pikuach Nefesh overrides the Torah, that even in the case of doubt we violate the Torah law, that's derived from the pasuk V'chai B'hem in the Gemara in Yuma. It does not apply to Vishamru. When it's a Vishamru balance situation, then you need Vada. And Vishamru will apply even to resurrect the dead when there's no V'chai B'hem, but only on the condition that it's Vada and it's definite. Whereas if you have a live person, and you're not sure if your medical procedure, etc., in violating the Shabbos will save the person's life, here the Gemara says, based on a special Yalfusa, that V'chai B'hem applies even in a case of Safek, even in a doubt situation. But that's unique to V'chai B'hem, because V'chai B'hem is all about overriding Torah laws. It's what we call a matir. A matir means when the Torah gives you leniency and allows you to override the Torah. And the Torah allows you to override a v'chai b'hem, a dangerous situation to save a life if the person's alive, even in the case of suffering. But Vishamru is a different halach entirely. Vishamru has nothing to do with overriding Yisurim. It has to do with observing the Shabbos. With that balance and that decision, what pays off here in a pragmatic decision? Vishamru will apply even when V'chai B'hem does not apply, because the baby is dead already. And there's no V'chai B'hem to resurrect someone from the dead. Elio is only able to do this. His license was based on the fact that we have a principle called Vishamru. And Vishamru doesn't require V'chai B'hem. Vishamru is independent of V'chai B'hem. But it has its own restrictions, which don't apply to V'chai B'hem. That is the restriction that it's got to be Vada. Elio had to be absolutely convinced. And now, based on this, we begin to answer the 4 questions that we opened up with. Rashi and the Rambam established that the principle of V'chai B'hem could not apply b'derech sgula, when the Torah says that you can override its violations for the sake of saving someone's life. That's only with that kind of therapeutic method, which, if it wasn't in contradiction with a barrier of an Isur Torah, you would normally do so. And in a case of derech segula, that's not the normal way that you go about administering medical help. That's not included under v'chai b'hem. So you might apply the principle of vishamru. Let's use this derech segula to guarantee that this person will observe the Torah in the future, more Shabbosos. Let's give up one Shabbos and violate. No. For vishamru, we need vada. And unless we have a refuah, b'derech teva, that we can prove scientifically in the natural law of the universe, then there's never going to be a vada. You can never be definite about a segula. And therefore, if we accept this interpretation of the Rambam and before him of Rashi, we could not violate the Shabbos for a derech segula. Let's skip to question number 4, and we'll go backwards. The man says, I beg you, call up my Hasidic Rebbe on Shabbos. He will pray on my behalf. That's not a derech refuah. That is derech segula. There is no scientific explanation for how the bracha of the Rebbe will save your life. Moreover, it's not definite. So mimanavshach, no matter how you slice the cake, you cannot override the Shabbos. If you're dealing with v'chai b'hem, and I hope I'm not insulting anyone here, because I know that there's at least one person in the audience who's married to someone who stems from Bavuv. So I don't mean to, in any way, maybe someone would say that the bracha from the Bavuv Rebbe is Vadai. I don't know. But right now, we're dealing with Lakewood, New Jersey. Well, again, I don't know. Not sure anymore. It used to be that Lakewood was Litvish. Now I don't know anymore. So I'm very confused about Lakewood today. But even as it may, from a position of pure halacha, I have to tell you that mimanashach, you can't override the Shabbos in order to get this Hasidic Rebbe to give a bracha. Maybe we believe that the Rebbes have mofsim, so maybe the Rebbe will already know 6,000 miles away that he's got to pray and give a bracha for this kolan. And now we go back to question number 3, and that is folklore, as I call it, anecdotal evidence. Yeah, this ointment has helped a number of people who had corona. Ask your local physician. You're lucky if he doesn't slam the phone down on you. He's going to laugh you out of the ballpark. What are you talking about? There's no scientific evidence that this mishcha, this ointment, is in any way therapeutic. We will not violate the Shabbos for something that is not a derech refuah. A derech refuah requires one of two things. Either there is a general acceptance in the scientific world that this is a refuah, or at least, as the Rashba mentioned with regard to Kamiyah, there's one mumcha, one expert, who, although he might not understand how it is therapy for corona, he does know that it helped time after time. It was tested and proven. The scientific community might not have accepted this. But we have one expert who calls it a refuah. That's enough to qualify as a refuah. And the Rashba says that v'shamru b'nei Yisrael Shabbos means that kol ma sheyochol lasos b'kei sheyishmar Shabbos yaseh. According to the Rashba, we do everything that we can to extend life, even if it means violating the Shabbos, because he will fulfill many other Shabboses down the line. But for that, we need a vadai. And if we don't have a vadai, then v'shamru as a chiyuv hatzolah does not apply. And certainly not derech segula. And derech segula doesn't apply, according to Rashi and the Rambam, even in v'chai b'hem. So you've got two strikes, mimanavshach. It doesn't matter which way you go. You cannot be matir derech segula, neither through v'chai b'hem, which requires a specific restricted mechanism to be mater isurim. And I have to tell you, before I conclude the other two tshuvas, which will just take me 5 minutes, I have chills up my spine from a quote here. Brilliant. Who would ever have thought in a million light years to quote the following Ramban in his work called Toras HaOdam? You know, people know the Ramban either from his Chidushim on Shas. Some know the Ramban from his commentary on the Torah. I myself spent 2 years in Toronto teaching Ramban al Torah. I think, Joe, you'll remember those days, yeah? Joe is somewhere here. I guess he had to go. Anyway, you'll trust me on that one. But who quotes the Ramban in Torah Sa'ad? An amazing Ramban. The Ramban is interpreting a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim. We all know the pasuk, Rapo Yerape. And he will administer medical treatment. And the Gemara says in Bava Kama, Mikan shenitna rishus l'rofe l'rapos. That now the Torah is giving license to the physicians to apply and administer medical therapy. Says the Ramban. What's included in V'rapo Yerape? Anything that's included in V'chai. Meaning that if this methodology would override the Shabbos in a case of Pikuach Nefesh, then it's included under V'rapo Yerape. The command that enjoins a physician to administer and cures is contingent on V'chai. And if that be the case, no one could claim that Rapo Yerape, the obligation on the shoulders of a Rofe, would include skula. We never asked physicians to be experts in metaphysical, supernatural methods of therapy. And if it's not included in Rapo Yerape, and it's not included in the obligation of a physician, then ipso facto, says the Ramban, it's not included in V'chai. I'll tell you the Torah's endless. Therefore, Ladina. Now let's just summarize his conclusions as we come to the end of the hour. Ein lechalas haShabbos lekabel bracha mitzadik b'Shabbos klal uklal. He says that the only possible argument that one could put forward in favor of violating the Shabbos in order to invoke the blessing of the Rebbe is what's called Yisumei Daita. You remember that the Rashba said we don't allow writing amulets on Shabbos if it's not an expert, unless the Chola himself asks for the amulet. And that's called Yisumei Daita. He's in a state of bewilderment, of confusion. We got to calm him down. We know today, I mean, the study of psychology will tell you how important psychological health is in medical treatment. He says, he says, then, Yishtadil al Yidei Akum, try to find a guy to call the Rebbe and see if he can get through to the Rebbe. Maybe by now, depends whether it's a 6-hour or 7-hour difference, maybe by now it's Oy Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, although the Chassidim usually keep Shabbos for another couple of hours. Then he talks about L'shaker. Can you lie to the patient and tell him, yeah, don't worry, I'm calling up your Rebbe. He's going to give you a bracha, just to calm him down. He's not big on that, I think. You know, lying and bluffing is not always the best way to go, as much as we're tempted to do. Then he writes, Lechal Shabbos Litzorach Refuah She'eni Yedua. If you want to use this mishcha, this ointment, which is Eini Yedua, in order to try and attempt to save the life of someone, and therefore you have to violate the Shabbos, he says, that's like a skula. There's no scientific evidence that al pi derech hateva this could be helpful. Ellen Kane, he says, Yesh mi she, somebody who has a background in refuah, and Yesho Nisayon, that he had experience. He may not know how scientifically and medically this ointment will save the life of the patient, and it's a valid treatment, but he says, I have experience. We've tried it over and over again, but he's a rofe. And if he's a rofe, he can upgrade this treatment to the status of a refuah, which would make it, according to the Ramban, included in Rapo Yerape, the obligation, and also in Vishamru. However, our Mechaber, when he gets to the first two questions, and he says the following, we're talking about plasma donations. And he says that Legabe Magefas Corona, we don't know exactly which method is going to heal. But Budku Oso Harofin, there is a group of medical experts who have checked out the possibility of therapy through plasma for those who have antibodies. The recovery cases. I see one of them here. Okay, I'm another one. He says, Pashut, he has no doubt. She'im badku rofim trufazu yesh l'chal Shabbos alel. We will violate the Shabbos for the sake of a plasma donation for someone who has antibodies. And he says, we don't have to wait until the authorities, the health authorities, have given the absolute okay with regard to these injections. He says, Lasos dvorim afilum hem kruchim im harbe malachas doraisa. We're going to have to violate many different malachas doraisa. Kedei lasof plasma. Vade muto lasos came. We are allowed to violate the Shabbos for the sake of plasma. If we have in front of us a critically ill person, or alternatively, if we anticipate within a reasonable amount of time, there will be critically ill corona patients. And he describes the situation in which, unfortunately, in that wave, it's just one patient after the other. We may not have someone, give him a name, in front of us right now, but we're absolutely sure, tragically, unfortunately, that there'll be others that'll come through. The Kevon de Kol Yom, every single day, if we delay, Im nakdim es harafua yecholim lahatzil yoser nefashos. We are convinced that every day, every minute that passes counts. If we delay this process, more people never will perish. He asked the question about a guy. He says he was in touch with Reb Shlomo Miller of Toronto, and he says Reb Shlomo Miller gave the okay. And how much more so in New Jersey, where there are so many Jewish people. So if you don't know whether or not your violation of the Shabbos with your plasma is definitely going to go to a Jew, you can assume it might go to the Jew. And this comes under V'chai Bohem. Because here we're talking about a live person, not a dead person. We're not resurrecting from the dead like Elio. And number two, we're talking about a refuah that has the backing of mumchim, of experts. This is a scientific, natural refuah of antibodies. We're not talking about a skula. We're not talking about my Alta Baba told me that this can help. With all due respect to my Alta Baba. This is not a Baba Maisa. This is scientific. And even if it means that there's going to be a process in the first question that we asked, nevertheless, Chayav Lasos Kol Mai Deboy. He's obligated to do whatever he can do. Af b'Shabbos v'af b'Yontif. V'im yochel asos al yidei akum, those malachas that he can do through a guy. Hareu Chayav Lasos Kol. But he says, if it's a matzav bahul, if it's absolutely urgent, someone's life is in the balance, then he says, don't even bother looking for an ak, even a gadol shel Yisrael. should violate the Shabbos. Even if we don't know for sure that this is going to save a life, even if there are many Rofim who say this is not the proper therapeutic method, we have Rofim, we have experts. It's Derech HaTeva. We're not talking about Derech School. We will override the Shabbos. And as I end the shir, I thank everyone for joining me today. And again, we ask Rabbi Silva Zatzal to be a Melis Yoch on our behalf, on behalf of the entire community, on the behalf of all of Klal Yisrael, to bring an end to this Magefa. The numbers are staggering. In Europe, I'm told they still don't have it under control. I don't know what's going on exactly in Canada today. Hopefully you'll get the vaccine if you haven't already gotten it. Here, wherever you turn, Baruch Hashem, almost everyone's been vaccinated. If they haven't been, it's because they had Corona. And his blessed memory should be an inspiration for us to emulate him, who in turn is an emulation of our greatest Rebbe, the Rebbe of all time for Klal Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Keni Ratzon. Amen. If there anyone who wants to stay on for an extra few minutes before I have to run to Mincha, it's Hamchkia over here in this part, and continue our discussion. So I think you have the ability to unmute yourself, if I'm not mistaken.
Rabbi Berzon?
Yes.
So the way science works is someone has to be first.
Zell, how are you, Zell?
I'm good. Believe me, I can't wait to get back to your street. I'm 4 doors away and I haven't been there in a year and a half, you know? Can't get back because of the rules yet, but
my wife just got back. She was stranded for a month in New York City.
So the way science works is that somebody has to be first. So we have an example here in Bikur Cholim where a woman was kicked out of Mount Sinai Hospital because she refused to die. She said, we're not palliative care. They kicked her out. She's a cancer patient, and she went to Sunny Brook. The doctor told me, guys, someone has tremendous skill. Someone told me that the doctor told me when she came in, she had 15 minutes left to live when she was moved to Sunnybrook. The doctor said, would you mind if I try something? And the doctor, you know, kind of came up, she's the first to invent this particular cure. And she decided to try it on the patient because with 15 minutes left to live, there's nothing to lose. And I visited the patient and she got out of the hospital and she lived for another 2 years and had 5 simchas during that time. So, but the question is at that point, and by the way, it happened to be a Frum doctor and it wasn't a Shabbos, it was a Monday. But when there's 15 minutes left to live and the person in their mind, through their laboratory work feels, I tried this on, I don't know what they do, mice, dogs, whatever. I'd like to try it on the patient. There's nothing to live. If you look at science, the Shabbos. You do, but it's a long shot because they're the first, right? There's no scientific.
And if she or he, in this case is she, had experience, and we're talking about not skula but derech hateva, she may not know, because even to this day there's so much confusion about this disease called corona, but she may have the experience. She has the scientific background. The treatment has not been approved by the health authorities. It's a situation of saving a life. Whatever the possibility is, it's v'chai b'hem. It's not derech skula. Again, I'm not a posek, Zale, you know that. But I'm just telling you, I'm here to present various poskim. And it happens to be, those who are with me know that at the end of a shir, I like to quote Rav Weiss. I have here an entire sefer called the Minchas Osher. It's just came out, Chodesh Adar. It's got over almost 600 pages. And this I didn't find. I was going to talk today about the question of mikvos and sending a woman to the ocean if she doesn't want to go to the mikvah, so forth and so on. And I have a 6-page tshuva from one of the Rabbanim, the Big Day Chamudos in Flatbush in Brooklyn. And the Minchas Osher just poo-poos the whole question. We're not going to allow it to go to the ocean. He doesn't even raise the issue. But what I can tell you is that almost every issue that we've covered, he has in this 600-page book, which makes it a little bit boring for me because, but I never agree with him. Anyway, this issue that we discussed today, he doesn't address. And I only found it in the Sefer Lahachios Hamrav, which I'm hoping will arrive in the Sfarim stores on Bathurst so that you can all get a hold of the Sefer. Is there anyone here from Lakewood who knows this rabbi? Again, I'm just using his Sefer. I don't know him at all. The name, he's actually not in Lakewood. His shul is in a place called what? Thames River? How do you pronounce it?
Tom's River.
Tom's River.
It's next door.
It's part of Lakewood. It's part of the three.
Yeah. I mean, I know it is Lakewood. They call it by a fancy name. It's like Far Rockaway and the 5 towns. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But be that as it may, this man writes a beautiful tshuva. I don't think he wrote it. I have a feeling that one of his students wrote it because I found quite a few typos or structural errors. But it's a beautiful piece, in my humble opinion.
So just to be clear, if the doctor is first, but they feel they did scientific testing in their lab and it's worth a shot, they don't have to wait till it's generally accepted. They could go first because there is a Toronto doctor like this now. He's very advanced, but he feels he's ahead of the curve by a million miles because he's a little out of the formal system and he'll give it a shot. Okay.
I think it's it's definitely something that would override the Shabbos, at least according to, again, if there's a possibility, but in your scenario, 15 minutes, you don't have the possibility. Chazal say, Kol HaShoel HaReizeh Shofech Damim. But if it's not urgent within 15 minutes, now most of the Rabbanim who paskin for Hatzolah, they keep their phones open on Shabbos. So whatever the method is. So then I would encourage and insist that you ask the Shaila. But again, you got 15 minutes. It's Hashofech Damin. And do whatever you can. And Sofek Vikuach Nefesh, we derive from V'chai Bohem that it overrides the Shabbos. Again, Vishamru, you need Vada. There's no such thing as Sofek. The Gemara derives Sofek Vikuach Nefesh from V'chai Bohem and not from Visham. All right, I'm going to have to apologize.
Okay.
As I say, it's getting a little dark here in these parts. I know where you are. It's time to catch the last minion in Clanton Park, I guess. But here, yeah. All right. All the best, everyone, and thanks. Thanks for being.